My name is Grace. I'm 34 years old, and I never expected a simple restaurant dinner to reveal exactly how my family really felt about my son, until the day it did. We'd planned the reunion dinner for months, an annual tradition my extended family had kept going since I was a child myself, gathering everyone together at the same steakhouse every summer. This year, my mother had taken charge of the reservations, proudly announcing in our family group chat that she'd pre-ordered special kids steaks for all the grandchildren, a treat she said they deserved. I remember feeling grateful reading that message, thinking how thoughtful it was of her to plan ahead, to make sure every child at the table would feel celebrated during our time together that evening. I helped Noah get dressed that afternoon, watching him carefully button his favorite shirt, excited about seeing his cousins, chattering happily about the games they'd play before dinner started. He'd always looked forward to these family gatherings, though I'd sometimes noticed subtle things over the years. Comments left unsaid, glances exchanged, moments that made me quietly uneasy, without concrete proof. Noah was 7 years old, thoughtful and quiet by nature. The only biracial grandchild among nearly a dozen cousins in my otherwise fairly traditional, homogeneous extended family. I'd married outside what my parents considered the expected path, and though nobody ever said anything explicitly cruel, I'd sensed an undercurrent of distance whenever Noah was involved in family events. I told myself repeatedly that I was being overly sensitive, that my parents loved their grandson the same way they loved every other grandchild, that any distance I noticed was simply my own imagination. That evening, walking into the restaurant, the space buzzing with laughter and the clinking of glasses, I felt genuinely hopeful, watching Noah run ahead excitedly to greet his cousins at the table. We settled into our seats, the long table stretching across the private dining room my mother had reserved specifically for this occasion, string lights hanging warmly above us throughout the ceiling. Conversation flowed easily around the table, aunts and uncles catching up, cousins comparing summer vacation stories, the comfortable chaos of a large family gathering settling familiarly around us. I glanced over at Noah periodically, watching him engage happily with his cousins, showing them a toy he'd brought, laughing at something one of them said, seemingly unaware of anything unusual happening. The waiter approached eventually, holding a small notepad, explaining that he'd be bringing out the pre-ordered kids' meals first, a special surprise my mother had apparently arranged in advance for everyone. I smiled, glancing toward my mother, appreciating the thoughtful gesture, watching her beam proudly as she prepared to explain the surprise she'd clearly been looking forward to sharing with the grandchildren. "I ordered everyone the filet, kids' portion," she announced happily to the table, several children cheering excitedly at the mention of steak, clearly thrilled about the special treat awaiting them. The waiter began reading names off his notepad one by one, matching each child to their pre-ordered meal, cousins responding eagerly as their names were called out around the crowded table. I watched happily as each child's name was announced, waiting patiently for Noah's turn, expecting to hear his name called any moment among the excited chorus of children responding around us. The waiter continued down his list, name after name, cousin after cousin, until finally reaching the end of his notepad, looking up expectantly as if the entire order had been completed already. I felt something shift uncomfortably in my chest, glancing quickly around the table, realizing Noah's name hadn't been mentioned once throughout the waiter's entire list of pre-ordered children's meals. I looked toward my mother instinctively, expecting some explanation, some acknowledgement of what suddenly felt like an obvious, glaring omission sitting heavily in the air between all of us at that table. She glanced briefly at Noah, then back toward her menu, seemingly unbothered, as if she hadn't quite processed yet what everyone else at that table was clearly beginning to notice and quietly register. Noah looked up at me, his small face registering confusion mixed with something that made my chest tighten instantly. That particular expression children have when they realize they've been left out. Noah was 7 years old that summer, thoughtful beyond his years, The kind of child who noticed things adults often assumed went unnoticed by someone so young and quiet. He was the only biracial grandchild among nearly a dozen cousins in my extended family, his father's heritage blending with mine in a way that had never been an issue for me, though I sometimes wondered about others. I'd married outside what my parents quietly considered the expected path, and though nobody in my family ever said anything explicitly cruel about it, I'd felt an undercurrent of distance over the years. It showed up in small ways: comments about Noah's hair texture, questions about which side he favored more, moments that stung quietly without ever crossing clearly into something I could confront directly. I'd always told myself I was being overly sensitive, that my parents loved Noah the same way they loved his cousins, that whatever distance I sensed was simply my imagination working overtime unnecessarily. Sitting at that table now, watching the waiter double-check his notepad, I felt that old uneasy feeling returning stronger than ever, refusing to be quietly dismissed the way I'd dismissed it so many times before. "Is that everyone?" my mother asked the waiter, glancing briefly around the table, seemingly still unaware of the obvious gap sitting uncomfortably between her words and the reality in front of her. "That's everyone on my list," the waiter confirmed, flipping his notepad closed, completely unaware of the tension quietly building around the table as several adults exchanged uncertain glances. I looked down at Noah, watching his small shoulders slump slightly, his earlier excitement fading into something quieter, something far too mature for a 7-year-old to already understand so clearly. "Mom," I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the tightness building in my chest, "you forgot to order for Noah." I watched her expression shift into mild confusion, then dismissal. "Oh," she said simply, glancing toward Noah as if just now truly registering his presence at the table. "I must have miscounted. It's fine, sweetheart. You can order something else." Noah nodded quietly, picking up his menu without complaint, scanning it briefly before setting it back down. "Chicken fingers are fine," he said softly, barely audible over the surrounding conversation. I felt my chest tighten painfully at how easily he accepted it, how quickly he adjusted his expectations downward, as if some part of him had already learned not to expect too much from these gatherings. The waiter nodded, jotting down the new order, moving on quickly to check on another table, completely unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding in that private dining room around us. I watched my mother return to her conversation with my aunt, seemingly unbothered, as if nothing significant had just happened, as if forgetting one child's meal was simply an unremarkable oversight. Around us, the other children began receiving their steaks, plates arriving one by one, cousins cheering happily, completely oblivious to the quiet moment their grandmother had just created beside them. Noah watched the other kids' plates arrive, his eyes following each steak as it passed, though he didn't say anything else, didn't complain, simply waited patiently for his chicken fingers to arrive instead. I reached over and squeezed his hand gently under the table, trying to communicate silently that I'd noticed, that this mattered, that he wasn't imagining the unfairness sitting quietly between us. He looked up at me and offered a small smile, the kind of resilient smile children give when they're trying to reassure the adults around them that everything is actually fine, even when it clearly isn't. I forced myself to smile back, though inside, something had shifted permanently, a quiet anger building steadily beneath my composed exterior as dinner continued around us as if nothing had happened. I excused myself briefly during dessert, needing air, needing a moment away from the table to process everything that had just unfolded so casually in front of an entire family gathering. I found my mother a few minutes later, stepping outside toward the parking lot herself, and something in me decided this conversation couldn't wait any longer for a more convenient moment to happen. I caught up to her near her car, the evening air cooler now, the parking lot lights casting long shadows across the pavement between us as I approached her quietly. "Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can we talk for a minute?" She turned toward me, her expression shifting slightly, perhaps sensing what was coming next in this conversation. Grace, if this is about dinner, it was just a simple mistake, she said quickly, already reaching for her car keys, clearly hoping to avoid the conversation entirely before it fully began. How do you forget one child? I asked directly, keeping my voice level despite the anger building steadily beneath my composed exterior throughout that entire evening at the restaurant. She sighed, leaning against her car door, her expression shifting into something defensive now, the same expression I remembered from childhood whenever accountability felt uncomfortable for her. I didn't think he'd care that much, honestly, she said, shrugging slightly. He's not picky like the others. He's easygoing. I figured he wouldn't mind ordering something different. I felt my chest tighten painfully at her explanation, the casualness of it landing harder than any raised voice or direct confrontation could have managed in that quiet parking lot between us. He's not picky, I said, my voice shaking now despite my best efforts to stay calm. He's excluded, Mom. There's a difference, and I think you know that difference perfectly well. She rolled her eyes slightly, crossing her arms. You're being dramatic, Grace. It was one dinner order. Kids forget these things quickly. I'm sure Noah's already forgotten about it himself. He hasn't forgotten, I said firmly. He sat there watching every other cousin get their steak, and he didn't say a word, because he's already learned not to expect things at these gatherings. That's not fair, my mother said, her voice sharpening slightly now, defensiveness creeping fully into her tone. I love that boy just as much as I love my other grandchildren, Grace. Then why does this keep happening? I asked, my voice breaking slightly. The comments about his hair, the questions about which side he takes after more. Tonight's dinner. It adds up, Mom. She was quiet for a moment, her jaw tightening, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation had turned, though she still wasn't fully willing to acknowledge what I was directly pointing out. I think you're reading too much into things, she said finally, though her voice lacked full conviction now, like even she recognized how weak that explanation sounded once spoken aloud between us. I'm not overreacting, I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to surface. I'm asking you to actually see him, the same way you see his cousins, without hesitation or excuses. I do see him, she insisted, though something in her tone still felt hollow, unconvincing, like she was defending an image of herself rather than actually reflecting on what I'd just said. Then prove it, I said quietly. Not with an apology tonight, with how you treat him going forward. That's the only thing that will actually mean anything to me at this point. She didn't respond right away, the silence stretching uncomfortably between us, filled only with the distant sound of laughter still drifting out from the restaurant behind me. I have to get back inside, I said finally, turning to walk away, unwilling to continue a conversation that clearly wasn't going to reach any real resolution that particular evening. Grace, she called after me, though I didn't turn back around, continuing toward the restaurant entrance, needing to return to Noah before he wondered where I'd disappeared to for so long. I walked back inside, taking a slow breath before rejoining the table, forcing a calm expression for Noah's sake, though the conversation with my mother continued echoing uncomfortably in my mind. The rest of the evening passed quietly, dessert arriving, family photos being taken, everyone smiling for the camera as if nothing uncomfortable had happened between my mother and me outside. I drove home that night with Noah asleep in the back seat, replaying my mother's words over and over, wondering how many more moments like tonight's dinner he'd quietly absorb before something changed. 2 weeks passed after that difficult conversation. Life settling back into its normal rhythm, Noah returning to school, summer afternoons filled with sprinklers and popsicles in our backyard. I hadn't spoken much to my mother since that night in the parking lot, our usual weekly phone calls growing shorter, more strained, both of us avoiding the topic that still sat unresolved between us. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was picking Noah up from school, my father's name flashing across the screen, his voice tight and urgent the moment I answered. Grace, it's your mother, he said. His words rushed together. She collapsed at the grocery store. They're taking her to the hospital now. It's her heart. You need to come quickly. My stomach dropped instantly, panic flooding through me as I buckled Noah into his car seat, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to process what my father had just told me over the phone. I drove straight to the hospital, Noah asking quiet questions from the back seat about Grandma, about what was happening. My mind racing too fast to fully answer him the way he deserved. We arrived to find my father pacing the emergency room waiting area, his face pale, explaining quickly that doctors suspected a serious cardiac event requiring emergency surgery as soon as possible. She needs surgery immediately, he said, his voice shaking. But there's a complication. She has a rare blood type, and the hospital's blood bank doesn't have enough of a compatible match available. I felt my chest tighten at his words, understanding immediately the seriousness of what he was describing, the urgency evident in every line of worry etched across his exhausted face. A nurse approached us shortly afterward, clipboard in hand, explaining that they needed to test immediate family members quickly to determine if anyone present could serve as a compatible donor. "We'll test everyone here," she said calmly, though urgency remained clear beneath her professional composure. Time matters significantly given her current condition and the surgery timeline. My father was tested first, his blood type coming back incompatible within minutes, his shoulders sagging with disappointment as the nurse moved quickly toward testing me next in the sequence. My own results came back incompatible as well, panic building steadily inside me as precious minutes ticked by, my mother's surgery window narrowing with every incompatible result returned to us. "Is there anyone else in the family who might be available?" the nurse asked, glancing at her clipboard, clearly running through the standard protocol for locating compatible donors as quickly as possible. I thought immediately of Noah, hesitating slightly, uncertain whether children were typically included in emergency donor testing, though desperation eventually outweighed my hesitation completely. "My son is here," I said quietly. "He's 7. Would that be possible?" The nurse nodded, explaining that pediatric donors could sometimes be tested depending on the specific circumstances involved. Noah looked up at me, his small face registering confusion mixed with concern. "Can I help Grandma?" he asked earnestly, already understanding enough to know something serious was happening around him. "We're going to find out, sweetheart," I told him gently, squeezing his hand reassuringly as the nurse prepared the necessary equipment for a quick, simple blood type test right there in the waiting area. The test took only a few minutes, though it felt like hours, my heart pounding as we waited for results that could determine whether my mother received the surgery she desperately needed in time. The nurse's expression shifted slightly as she reviewed the results, glancing between her clipboard and Noah with something like surprise crossing her otherwise professional, composed demeanor entirely. "He's a match," she said, relief evident in her voice. "A perfect match, actually. This is exactly what we needed to move forward with your mother's surgery immediately without further delay." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed almost instantly by something more complicated, remembering clearly the dinner table 2 weeks earlier, where this same child had been so easily overlooked. My father's face flooded with relief and gratitude, though something behind his eyes suggested he too understood the painful irony unfolding in front of all of us in that hospital waiting room. I looked down at Noah, who seemed to sense the importance of the moment, despite not fully understanding the medical details. His small hand still held tightly within my own throughout the entire process. "Am I going to help Grandma now?" he asked, and something in his earnest, uncomplicated willingness to help the very family that had overlooked him broke my heart completely in that quiet hospital hallway. "Yes, sweetheart," I told him softly, kneeling down to his level. "You're going to help Grandma feel better." He smiled brightly, that same resilient smile he'd offered me 2 weeks earlier at dinner. The medical team moved quickly after that, explaining the donation process carefully to both of us, reassuring Noah gently that it would only take a little while and wouldn't hurt very much at all. I sat beside him in a small side room, holding his hand as a nurse prepared everything needed, watching him remain remarkably calm despite the seriousness of what was happening around him. "Is Grandma really sick?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. "She's very sick," I admitted honestly, "but the doctors think this is going to help her get better." He nodded seriously, the way children do when they're trying hard to understand something bigger than themselves, something that mattered enough to make the adults around him this worried. Once the donation was complete, a nurse led us back toward the main waiting area where my father sat gripping the edge of his chair, his eyes red-rimmed from the stress of the past hour. "They're taking her into surgery now," he said, standing quickly. "The donation should be enough. Thank God." His voice cracked slightly, relief and exhaustion both evident in every word he spoke. I settled into a chair beside him, Noah climbing quietly into my lap despite being technically too old for it, needing the comfort after everything that had happened so quickly that afternoon. Time moved slowly in that waiting room, the three of us sitting together in tense silence, occasionally interrupted by hospital announcements or the distant sound of footsteps hurrying down hallways. Eventually, a nurse approached, informing us that the surgery had gone smoothly and that my mother was now in recovery, though she would remain groggy and disoriented for the next several hours. "Would you like to see her briefly?" the nurse asked. My father nodded immediately, standing quickly, though I hesitated slightly, glancing down at Noah, uncertain how this moment should unfold. We walked together toward her recovery room, my father entering first, my mother's eyes fluttering open weakly as he approached her bedside, relief washing visibly across her tired features. I stood in the doorway with Noah, watching quietly, uncertain whether to bring him inside yet, still processing everything that had happened between the dinner table and this hospital room. My father leaned close to my mother, speaking quietly, and I watched her expression shift suddenly, her eyes widening slightly before searching the doorway until they landed directly on us. "Grace," she said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Was it Noah?" I nodded slowly, stepping further into the room, keeping my hand protectively on my son's shoulder. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly, understanding fully now, settling over her exhausted features, the painful irony of the situation clearly registering deeply within her in that quiet room. "He was the only match," I said quietly, watching her carefully, unwilling to soften the moment more than necessary given everything that had happened between us just 2 weeks earlier at dinner. She looked at Noah standing beside me, her lips trembling slightly, tears now falling freely down her cheeks as she struggled to find words adequate enough for the moment unfolding in front of her. "Grace, I didn't mean—" she started, her voice breaking completely, unable to finish the sentence as the weight of everything came crashing down around her in that hospital recovery room. I cut her off gently, my voice steady despite the emotion still sitting heavily in my own chest after everything that had unfolded across these past 2 difficult weeks between us. "Noah wants to help you," I said quietly. "That's who he is. I just hope you finally see him now, the same way you'd see any of your other grandchildren, without hesitation or excuses." She nodded slowly, tears still falling, reaching one weak hand toward Noah, who looked up at me uncertainly before I gave him a small, reassuring nod to approach her bedside carefully. He walked closer, taking her outstretched hand gently in his own small one. And something in that simple gesture seemed to communicate more forgiveness and grace than either of us could have spoken aloud. 3 months passed after that day in the hospital, and my mother's recovery continued steadily, each week bringing her a little more strength and a little more color back to her face. She started calling more often, not just to check in on me, but specifically to ask about Noah. Questions I'd never heard her ask so genuinely before that afternoon in the recovery room. "Does he still like dinosaurs?" she asked one evening, and I found myself smiling, surprised by how much she suddenly wanted to know about the grandson she'd once so easily overlooked. She invited us over for Sunday dinner a few weeks later. Nothing fancy, just the three of us at her kitchen table, though this time she'd asked Noah beforehand exactly what he wanted to eat. He'd chosen macaroni and cheese, and she'd made it from scratch, something I hadn't seen her do in years, watching carefully as Noah took his first bite and grinned up at her happily. "Good?" she asked, and he nodded enthusiastically, already asking for seconds, the easy comfort between them feeling different now, steadier, built on something more intentional than before. I watched them together that evening, my mother listening closely as Noah explained an elaborate story about his class's science project, nodding along, asking questions, genuinely engaged in his answers. It wasn't a perfect fix, not immediately. Old habits and unspoken tension didn't disappear overnight, and I still caught myself watching carefully, waiting to see if this change would actually last. But little by little, week after week, I noticed real effort. Small moments accumulating steadily, my mother remembering details about Noah's life she'd never bothered to ask about previously. At our next family gathering that fall, held again at the same steakhouse, my mother made a point of confirming Noah's order herself, sitting beside him as he chose exactly what he wanted to eat. When the waiter arrived with the kids' meals, Noah's name was called first this time, his steak arriving alongside his cousin's. No confusion, no oversight, nothing quietly forgotten or overlooked. I watched him beam with pride as his plate was set in front of him, completely unaware of the quiet significance behind that simple moment, though I felt tears prick unexpectedly at my own eyes. My mother caught my gaze from across the table and offered a small, knowing smile, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between us of exactly how far we'd come since that difficult night 2 seasons earlier. Later that evening, as we prepared to leave, my mother pulled Noah into a warm hug, whispering something quietly into his ear that made him laugh and hug her back just as tightly in return. "What did Grandma say?" I asked him gently as we walked toward the car, curious about whatever exchange had passed between them in that private, tender moment I hadn't been part of. "She said I'm her favorite dinosaur expert," he said proudly. And I laughed despite the lump forming in my throat, grateful for how simply and completely he'd accepted this new chapter between them. My name is Grace, and watching my son finally receive the easy, unquestioned inclusion he'd always deserved, I understood that sometimes it takes losing something precious to truly learn how to hold it carefully.